On this episode of the Most Notorious podcast, a serial killer terrorizes the city of London, Ontario.
What we do know is that Jackie got in the car voluntarily. She either felt disarmed by or recognized the passengers in the vehicle or the driver. So she got in and the vehicle did a U-turn. And instead of taking her downtown towards her house, heading north, it looped around and headed south out towards the country roads. And that is the area where her body was found 5 days later.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Great to have you with me. So I've got to say I've been getting some pretty good feedback from my new podcast, Aghast at the Past 1892. Give it a listen if you have some time. It's for people who love true crime history, just like you and me. And I'm having so much fun putting it together. And for those of you who haven't heard the most recent episode yet, yes, Deltina Davis is still missing. And yes, her supposed boyfriend, Bert Trefethen, is still acting extremely suspiciously. Okay, on to the interview. It is with great pleasure that I introduce my guest today, Vanessa Brown. She is a freelance writer, editor, bookstore owner, and London, Ontario historian. She is the author of The Grand Old Lady, The History of Hotel London, and London, 150 Cultural Moments. And she is the author of the book she's here to talk about today, The Forest City Killer, a serial murderer, a cold-case sleuth, and a search for justice. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Absolutely. So how did you get involved in this case to begin with?
Well, I've always been really interested in local history. I had a high school teacher, actually, who sort of pushed me in that direction and got me in the habit of hanging around in the archives, which became something I enjoy. And I also ended up working as an antiquarian bookseller. So that means research, working with old books, dusty old tomes, that sort of thing. That's, I guess you could say that's my jam. But when it comes to the local history stuff, working with the antiquarian books, a lot of used bookstores will tell you that local history can be your bread and butter sometimes, especially when it comes to making sales to libraries and selling books in London. I can find really cool books about London, especially when I buy books from an estate or something like that. So in addition to having my own interest in local history and stories about the place I'm from, it also became part of my job, which is to know, you got to know a little bit about your city. Otherwise, someone comes in and says, I'm looking for this particular book that was published in 1910, and you can't not know anything about it. You have to know something about it. So I've always known about my city's history, probably more than the average person. And then in 2015, Mike Arnfield released his book, Murder City, and I found out that London had this very dark history of serial murder. London actually has more serial killers per capita on record than any other city, at least known in criminological circles. Now, Mike's book was academic. It focused on the phenomenon of serial murder in London, Ontario. But what really got me interested were the unsolved cases. I like a good puzzle. So I started researching. I dug into it, logged on, of course, as we all do. That's our first thing, is to check it out online. And I found this incredible website called unsolvedcanada.ca, which is unfortunately no longer there. The site is gone forever, apparently. But I found out there was this community of people online who had been working on solving these cases for, years, ever since the internet made it possible for them to try. So I was able to get in touch with longtime sleuths, take advantage of the work they had done, which was plentiful. I mean, these are people who had spent their own free time going to the archives, digging around, finding photographs, tracking down witnesses, tracking down people who had information, and of course, the family members of the victims. So these unsolved serial murders in London became, some people do crossword puzzles. I ended up doing murder.
Right.
If that makes any sense. Yeah.
Makes sense. Well, I suppose you are able to keep your pulse on things from your perch at your bookstore. Meet all sorts of people with interesting stories from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yeah, the bookstore has been a really important platform for investigating because it means that there's a space where I'm always available to speak to someone. So a member of the public can approach me with very few barriers, right? It's not like if you say you think to yourself, I have information about this murder, I should really tell the police, but I don't know if it's important. And the barriers to sharing information about an historical case with law enforcement are pretty intense, really. I'm sure law enforcement would disagree, but as the average Joe, the idea of going down to the police station, where do you park? Which door do you go in? Who do you talk to? Are they even going to give you any of their time? Are they going to think that you are just some crazy person who came in off the street? If you want to call, who do you call? The non-emergency line? I mean, I think people know about Crime Stoppers, but a lot of the people I've spoken to have said to me, they didn't really know if their information was important. They didn't know really how to go about contacting the police. And honestly, talking to the police can be intimidating, whereas talking to your friendly local bookstore owner is, hopefully fun most of the time when you're not discussing murders of children. Yeah, a little more approachable, I think.
Right. So can you describe London, Ontario geographically? And also following up on that fact that your city is arguably the serial killer capital of the world. Who are some of the more infamous serial killers from London?
Sure. Well, so first I'll set the scene. London, Ontario is a city of, we're almost 500,000 at this point. In 1968, when the murders sort of began to take place, London had a population of 160,000 people, but also had just gone through a massive annexation. So the core of the city was probably more like 130, 140,000 people. And between 1968 and about 1984, really as the core years, you can take it back to 59 if you want to. London had this huge spate of unsolved murders, and we're right between Toronto and Detroit along this superhighway. So if you drive sort of northeast from Detroit towards Toronto, you'll pass right by a sign that says London, Ontario, and that's us. You can't really see the city from the highway, but it's there. It's a very waspy place, very white bread. Looking at the historical context of the city, a fair amount of racism, a lot of Protestantism, even prejudice against and bigotry against Catholics. So a very homogenous place, and also known, in addition to being the serial killer capital of Canada, if not the world, also known as a test market. So, for example, this is the first place we had Tim Hortons dark roast coffee, or chicken McNuggets from McDonald's were first unveiled in London, Ontario, because it is that sort of homogenous place that provides you a sample, but it also has enough diversity that it can give you a sort of sense of North American market tastes. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, so I can't really speak to that, but that gives you a sort of an idea of the tone of the city. It's a very pretty place. It also has a big gap between the rich and the poor. There's a lot of working class individuals out in the East End, where, there's more rental properties, people working, jobs right out of high school kind of thing. And we also, for a time, I believe in the 1950s and 60s, had more millionaires per capita than any other city in Canada. A lot of headquarters here. 3M has their headquarters here. Kellogg's had their headquarters here. General Motors had a big thing here, in the university as well. And the medical science community here it's a big center for medical sciences. So, a city that has a lot of wealth, an appearance of being a safe, white bread, banal kind of place, which really is a wonderful cloak to hide under if you want to do anything devious, especially when you're dealing with people who don't want to look at the nasty things about their city and are invested in keeping up this veneer of it being a pretty place. So during that time, there were the three, I call them the big three. And London, Ontario, we're looking at between 6 and 9 serial killers in a 10-year period, starting in the late 60s, going to the late 70s, early 80s. The big three are, there's Gerald Thomas Archer. He's the chambermaid slayer. His thing was to attack women. He'd go home with women who worked in bars or were maids in hotels, single women who were alone, usually in their 40s or 50s, and attack them, rape them, and murder them in their homes. There was Christian McGee, who technically is just outside of London. He is an interesting guy known as the Mad Slasher. The Mad Slasher was really someone you'd see in a 1970s horror movie. He was a super creep. He drove a pickup truck around town and he was the junk man and he picked up roadkill. He was sort of like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre type. His MO was he was a spontaneous, disorganized killer. He was very stabby. So he would see a woman walking down the street that he thought, I'm going to murder and rape that girl, and pull over and murder and rape her, or pick up a hitchhiker and murder and rape her, or rape and murder her in whichever order he chose. And then the third one is the most fascinating to me. And I would love to write a book on this subject, but I don't think Canadian privacy laws would ever make that possible. And that is, of course, Russell Johnson, the bedroom strangler. Russ Johnson was an attractive man, a large sort of bodybuilder. He worked out at Gold's Gym, sort of a Rocky, like a Sylvester Stallone type of guy. He was known around town as Good Old Russ. And I've heard lots of stories about him come out of the woodwork, especially since my book came out. He worked at a factory, and he apparently was the cleanest person anyone had ever seen. So he ironed his jeans, that kind of a thing. He was a meticulous guy. So in addition to being a rather eccentric and fascinating person on his own, his crimes are notoriously fascinating and difficult to categorize for criminologists. He would go out and get drunk and then go home and leave again, or on his way home, go into what he called a sort of reverie. And he would find an apartment building and he would scale it. He would climb up the side of it, parkour style, I guess, just by brute strength. This guy was so strong. And in this strange, drunken reverie, he would climb up the side of an apartment building. He said one time he went back the next day to see how high he had climbed, and it was 13 stories. Wow. And of course, when you're that high up, you don't lock your sliding door. So he would go into people's apartments. So many people have stories about, I woke up with Russ Johnson in my bedroom, and he would find women who were alone. He would strangle them and rape them, usually stockings or a found object in the apartment. And and leave them dead in their bed. And of course, as it went on, it got even more interesting. He would clean their apartments afterwards, not to hide evidence, but because he felt bad for killing them. So he'd wash their dishes. Just very, very strange fellow. So those are the big three. And of course, my murders, I call them my murders, of course, have nothing to do with any of those three. They are the unsolved cases from London, Ontario.
So the killer that you write about in your book, the Forest City Killer, did you coin that name?
Yeah, I did. And I did that for a reason. I'm a big fan of My Favorite Murder, the podcast, and that led me, of course, to Michelle McNamara, Billy Jensen, Paul Holes, and the Golden State Killer. And something I really took note of is something that Billy Jensen said. Actually, when I talked to Billy, he said this again to me. I met him in Toronto. We think of, and I'm sure I've heard Paul say this too, we build up these serial killers into supervillains, and we need superheroes. And this is something they talk about a lot, is focusing on the victims, which of course I tried to make the victims the main focus of my book rather than the killer, which is pretty easy to do when you don't know who the killer is. But the truth is that when it comes to getting attention to these cases and getting these cases solved, a moniker of a supervillain name does help sort of in, unfortunately, marketing that bad guy to catch the interest of the public. Who is the Forest City Killer, So I did that quite consciously. And I will fully admit that I took that idea from Michelle McNamara and her naming of the Golden State Killer, in which she encountered a similar problem. He was known as the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, Earons, this weird name, and it wasn't cohesive. So when she was building a narrative, she picked Golden State Killer. So I picked Forest City Killer. The book originally had a different name, but which was The English Girl, because I did want to make the focus on Jackie English, who is the main victim and the main story told in the book. But, I want them to catch this guy. So if Forest City Killer sticks in your mind, then that worked,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a great name. So speaking of Jackie English, that's where your book starts. So maybe we can too. Can you talk about her age, family life, where she was in her life in the days prior to her disappearance?
Sure. Jackie English was a 15-year-old girl living in London, Ontario in 1969. She lived with her mom, a single mom, a working mom, and her little brother in a sort of, well, at first they lived in a pretty shoddy, what we call tenement housing. And then they had just recently, before her murder, moved into a slightly better form of tenement housing, like a shared bathroom kind of situation, like a boarding house that was owned by her mother's boss. So, Jackie's mom had her own set of difficulties, and the kids worked. Jackie got work through her mother at a restaurant, and she liked making money. Jackie was, 15 meant something a bit different in 1969 than it does now. Jackie's older sister, Anne, who has become a good friend of mine, Anne was 1 year older than Jackie. She was 16, and she was already living with her fiance in Hamilton, planning on getting married. So for Jackie, when she's 15 years old and she gets this job, she is sort of feeling that adult vigor. She's growing up. She's feeling independent. And her mom was busy and distracted. Her little brother was 14, and he could sort of take care of himself for the most part. So, the summer of 1969, which, yes, I know is a Bryan Adams song, was really her chance to find herself in so many ways. And the more I got to know about Jackie's summer, she left a diary behind, and I was able to read that diary, and getting to know more about her through, talking to people who knew her and interacting with her sister. I could really imagine Jackie as a young woman full of spark. And, she probably had to have a fair amount of spark considering the situations that life handed her, a fair amount of self-sufficiency and independence. So, that was the summer she got her first job. She started exploring her sexual side and relationships with young men, and, working in the restaurant put her in the way of a lot of handsome young men working in the kitchen. So she also then got a second job, which was at this place called the Metropolitan. Now, the Metropolitan was a big chain in the 1960s, so it was all across Canada, sort of like a Zellers or a Woolco or not a Sears. It was more like a discount department store. And they had one in the south end of London, out by the 401. Now, of course, Eric, as I mentioned before, when you drive by London on the 401, you can't see the city. So you can imagine that this Metropolitan restaurant is really far out, and at the time, quite a rural space. And Jackie worked there at this sort of diner, and she had a shift from 5 p.m. till 10 p.m. during the week. Now, she'd been getting rides with her mom, who had a job out that way, but her mom went in for surgery. So in the first week of October in 1969, Jackie did not have a ride home from work. And that is where her story falls apart.
So, yes, October 4th, 1969. It was the last day that Jackie English was seen alive, and there were multiple eyewitness accounts of people seeing her get into a car. One of them saw her enter the back seats after it was opened by someone, inferring that there were multiple people inside. Yeah. Is that correct?
I think there were multiple people in there. But I have a pretty strong theory at this point about what happened. What we do know is that Jackie got in the car voluntarily. She either felt disarmed by or recognized the passengers in the vehicle or the driver. So she got in and the vehicle did a U-turn. And instead of taking her downtown towards her house, heading north, it looped around and headed south out towards the country roads. And that is the area where her body was found 5 days later. She was floating on her back in a creek, fully nude, under a bridge. She was found by a couple of duck hunters who were looking for low-lying waterfowl on October 9th. She'd been raped, she had been beaten about the head, and she had been left, in the water.
When we come back, more unusual circumstances surrounding Jackie English's death and a bizarre cast of characters complicate the investigation. Back again. Her clothes were nearby, right? And they appeared ripped apart.
Yeah, her clothes were strewn along the sides of the highways, the country roads near where her body was found, as if the driver had sort of flung them out the window. And her shoes were found nearby as well, at a pond next to a lover's lane. The pond was, I think, a former quarry. So the kind of place that local kids would gather and hang out and, maybe have a little heavy petting or whatever they were. That's just the old-fashioned way of saying making out in the back of a car.
Sure.
Yeah, which of course I now understand as well is for voyeurs and those who are inclined towards sexual homicide. It's a great place to watch. So, criminals who gravitate towards committing crimes in these lovers' lanes, it's quite common, have often visited there before, not as a lover, but as a voyeur and someone who likes to watch others.
So the timeline is a little strange, if you don't mind explaining it. So she was picked up on the 4th. Her body was found 5 days later. But authorities thought her body had been laying in the river for 48 hours. Is that correct?
There's a lot of discussion about that. And frankly, since the book has come out, I've gotten some information that I can't share because it's hold back information with police. My belief is now that she was in the water the entire time. I don't know, Eric. As soon as I say that out loud, I question myself. I've seen some crime scene photos. There's not a lot of skin slippage. Apparently there were, there were signs that she'd been in the water for the entire time, according to some law enforcement. It's difficult to say.
And then it's interesting that she wasn't dropped over the side, right? Someone actually carried her down and placed her in the water, right?
Yeah, that's another bit that's up for debate. But if you see how her body was posed, I think it's pretty unlikely that if you threw a body over this, this bridge is quite high up. I wouldn't jump off it, and it's a fairly shallow creek. So you'd think that a body that wasn't in rigor, it wouldn't land the way it did. You'd think she'd be more in a crumpled heap. She was sort of laid out, so on her back, one hand over her head in a fist, and that was the hand that had the only thing left on her body, which was a black Alaskan diamond ring that she'd gotten from her boyfriend, or her sort of boyfriend, the guy she'd been seeing. And her earrings had been removed from her ears and then tossed in the water nearby. And either they got caught on something or the water wasn't deep enough and the earrings didn't float away in whatever time it was elapsing since she was put there and she was found. So I put it this way, I would not be shocked if someone told me that she hadn't been there the whole time. If we find out who did it and they explain what they did, which probably will never happen, but if I had a time machine and I discovered that she had been, I'm quite confident she was killed the night she was taken, but and she couldn't have been held captive. There was no sign of ligature marks, no pre-mortem bruising other than the head wound. So, and no drugs in her system. The tox screen was totally clear. So I believe she was killed that night. And if she was kept, it would have had to be in a cool, dark place or some sort of a refrigeration to keep her for a few days. And that's still a possibility, But I'm more inclined to believe now in the less dramatic and less interesting idea, which is that her body's decomposition may have been slowed by the cool water and the shade under the bridge.
And that was something that multiple victims had in common, correct? That they were found on their back and bludgeoned in the head.
Yeah, so there are several other significant victims. So just to rewind a little bit, my book starts with the murder of Jackie English, and her story is the backbone of the book. And it's a very convoluted and fascinating story where we have, arsons, we have suicides, we have a courtroom drama, we have all sorts of interesting things that happen with the Jackie English case. But peripheral to that are other murders that are very similar. And in them we have blunt force trauma to the head, we have strangulation. They all involve transportation with a vehicle. They often involved a sighting of two men in the vehicle. They're always found in a wooded area or isolated area on their back, often partially dressed or fully nude, and they all have type O semen at the crime scene. So they're fairly obviously connected when it comes to the signature.
Right. And it wasn't just women killed, there were boys as well. And this group of victims together is generally known as the work of the Forest City Killer. Is that right?
There are 3 boys whose murders are also connected to the Forest City Killer through geography and through other aspects of the crime scene. And those are Frankie Jensen, Scott Leishman, and Bruce Stapleton. They're all covered in the book as well. And often people who look at these cases separate out the male victims and the female victims. And that's, the traditional way is to think serial killers often choose similar victims. That's the common knowledge. But it's not always the case. I think there may be more complicating factors when it comes to the unsolved London crimes, but it has confused individuals because, for example, one of the female victims has pink tissue paper stuffed in her mouth. One of the male victims has pink tissue paper stuffed in his mouth. 2 of the boys are found in water. 1 is found on land. All of the girls are found on land, but Jackie English is found in water. There are these sort of crossovers, and especially with the geography. So where one body is found, where another victim is picked up, that victim's body is found where another victim is picked up. So there's a sort of geographical chain between the victims. And I cover all of the victims in the book. But of course, I think the Jackie English story is the most revealing. It's also very intriguing because it doesn't seem to ever end over years and years. There's constant new information and twists and turns. And I also think it's the case that's most likely to bring a resolution to all of these unsolved cases, because clearly whoever committed her murder committed at least one of the others, if not all of them. So, finding a place to focus where you have the highest likelihood of a good outcome is sort of, that's one of the aspects of my research.
And there might have been more than one person involved in Jackie English's murder, right?
Yeah, I really do believe it's a pair. If law enforcement makes an arrest and a DNA match and I find out I'm wrong, that's fine. I'm not married to my theory. But my current working theory is that we have a pair of killers, and that the reason the victimology differs, the crime scenes have some things that are the same or some things that are different, is because you have two killers sometimes helping each other, maybe helping with a body disposal, maybe helping with an abduction. Each one likes something a little different, and they're sort of infecting each other's crime scenes in a way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah. There were a number of unusual things that happened in Jackie's life just prior to her death. A mysterious influx of cash into her bank account, and some strange sightings of her around town.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you mention that, Eric, because not a lot of people pick up on that. Because, of course, after Jackie's murder, a friend of her tried to commit suicide. There was a sort of a shrine of her things found. So, that's all very distracting. But prior to her disappearance, there are a few key things. One is that 2 weeks prior to her disappearance, Jackie and her family moved. But she was still seen back at her old apartment. And very oddly, hanging up a bathing suit on a clothesline in October, which, if you're from Florida, might not be weird. But in London, Ontario, Canada, it's a little odd to be swimming in October. Not many people do. And there is a story her brother tells, and he can't remember if it's before or after they moved. But Jackie said to him, "Oh, come with me. I want you to meet my new friends." And they went up into the old apartment building on Elmwood, where they had moved from. And they went into a different apartment, not the one they lived in. And there were these two men. And one of them was sitting, and he was the older one. And the younger one was standing. And Fred, Jackie's little brother, noticed that the older man who was sitting had, a funny shoe. And he said, "Oh, you're a cripple, are you?" And he was making kind of a joke. And he said the man looked at him with such anger that, Fred has wondered to this day if that was something that triggered his sister's murder, was that comment that he made. It really haunted him. So, we have potentially these two men hanging around the old apartment building. Jackie's hanging around the old apartment building. And then both her best friend and her boyfriend saw her carrying around this swimsuit and saying she was going swimming, but she never went swimming. She didn't have a towel. She didn't have wet hair. She's carrying around a swimsuit in a bag. So you can kind of assume that she's probably having photographs taken of her in the swimsuit, and that might be where the extra money had come from.
Something that I wanted to ask you about, her boyfriend. He actually had an alibi, right? The night she disappeared?
Yes, he did. David Papple. He was working.
But he had a brother, right, who may or may not have been involved in this.
That's interesting. He came up again recently. That's funny. I need to talk to this guy. His name's Rick Papple. And my apologies, Rick. He's friends with my stepdad, of all things. I found this out after the book came out. Not only did Rick Papple worked with my stepfather for like 20 years, he was at my mom and stepdad's wedding. He's in our family photo albums.
Oh my gosh.
Now, of course, the information I have, and I should mention this, Eric, I was very fortunate to have access to a retired homicide investigator's files. So that would be Detective Dennis Alsop, who was the lead investigator on the unsolved murders in London, Ontario in the 1960s. When he retired in the 1970s, he took some of his files home with him because these were, of course, the cases that he couldn't let go of. He wanted to keep working on them. So I was able to get some information about what is really an active investigation. So that's very unusual, especially in Canada, because our laws are extremely strict about what journalists can access here. So, there isn't information about Rick Papel. There's a little bit, and everything I have is in the book. But one of the things that guided me was knowing, okay, this is a veteran homicide investigator, a former Nazi codebreaker, and a very smart man with integrity from everything I've understood about him. So, if he's choosing which files he's going to bring home, I could really tell what his working theory was based on the files he chose. So I don't think Rick was particularly in his target, but a lot of people have mentioned Rick to me. And of course, your listeners don't know the whole story yet, but there is, of course, an eyewitness or pseudo eyewitness to the Jackie English abduction, who is later harassed and then attacked and then finally murdered in a horrific fire. And Rick Papel at one point delivered a typewriter to her house. And that was explained away. He was a delivery guy. He worked with my stepfather for a delivery service, actually, as a matter of fact. So, it was understood that there had been some mix-up or someone was playing a joke on him, and he delivered this typewriter to this woman who would later end up being murdered. So, people have looked at Rick, but I don't have a ton of information about him, to be honest.
Well, yeah. There are just so many fascinating, suspicious characters in this story. And I should have probably brought up the man in the green jacket earlier, who pops up more than once in your book, right?
Yeah, he's sitting outside of the restaurant where Jackie works, smoking his cigarette in a very distinctive way in his maroon car and giving the creeps to all the women who work there. Who's this guy sitting outside in this green jacket? And of course, Detective Alsop, the homicide investigator, he took real note of this green jacket. Later on, when there's persons of interest, he went to see, this guy works at the Green Giant plant, the vegetable company, Green Giant. And he went to see, do they wear green jackets at the Green Giant plant? There was also, with one of the little boys, Frankie Jensen, there was a man seen with a green jacket lurking around the area where where Frankie was taken and where the kids played near a public school. So the green jacket is fascinating to me.
I would like to ask you about the Harrisons, Betty and Vernon. Could you go into her connection with this case? She's such a fascinating character.
Yeah, the night that Jackie disappeared was October 4th. The night before, on October 3rd, Betty Harrison and her family were at the restaurant where Jackie worked. And when Jackie disappeared and was murdered, Betty came to the police and said she had seen two men in the restaurant, again, the night before Jackie was taken, talking to Jackie, and they upset her. She thought these were important. These were people of interest. And the police took that seriously. And they sat down with her husband, Verdon, and did a composite image, which was then widely published in the newspaper as a suspect. Now, I will point out before I go any further, I think it's very interesting that Betty and her husband and her son saw two men talking to Jackie, and yet they only gave one composite.
Yeah.
So that's a very large clue to me. I think they knew the other guy.
Yep.
And I think they may have been afraid of him. So after the composite is published, Betty starts getting harassing phone calls with the most violent sort of communications that this person who was calling her said heinous things. They were getting, knocks on their door in the middle of the night, threatening letters in the mail, all sorts of terrorizing was happening to the Harrison family. And then on December 11th, so that's 3 months after Jackie's murder, Betty, it was such a weird story, Eric. The short version is that Betty was out walking her dog in the country and she was attacked. She had 27 lacerations made by something like a razor blade. So they weren't deep. They weren't stabbings. These were cuts, and the person who did it was in her car. So they were on the right side of her body as she was in the driver's seat and he was in the passenger seat. So we have all these lacerations on her face, her shoulder, her hand, and her thigh. And then he left her alive. Of course, and then she's in the hospital. The police want a description of her attacker, and presumably whoever attacked her that night is the person from the composite who is the person who killed Jackie. So the attack on Betty Harrison becomes absolutely vital in the investigation into the Jackie English murder. And there's a lot about that attack that's very confusing, very perplexing. And frankly, I think it's because Betty Harrison was lying about a lot of things. I think she was hiding things. I think she was protecting somebody. It doesn't make sense to me if you're getting death threats, why you would then, and in fact, she had gotten a death threat that day, to then get in the car with your dog and go out to a country road in the middle of nowhere in the dark. That is completely nonsensical behavior to me. I think she went out there to meet somebody, and why this murderer, who she has now seen twice, would leave her alive is another perplexing question. But she comes back to London and she points the finger at this guy who is, and I mean, Eric, you can't write this stuff. I couldn't imagine this stuff. She points the finger at the guy who is the principal of the Children's Psychiatric Hospital. I mean, this is like a Ryan Murphy television show, like Mrs. Ratchet, It's totally bizarre. Like this guy, and he has a limp, and he works at a psych hospital. You couldn't get a creepier villain. So,
no, you couldn't.
You couldn't. And this is Glenn Fryer. So Glenn Fryer is arrested. He's put on trial for attacking Betty Harrison. And everyone's watching because, of course, they think if he attacked Betty Harrison, then he killed Jackie English. And if he killed Jackie English, he probably killed all of these other unsolved child murders in London, Ontario. So it was a pretty big media circus.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It must have been so frightening for young women in London, wondering if the killer was still out there, whether the killer was really Glenn Fryer. Were people convinced as the trial went on that he was the murderer?
People, to this day, people believe that he did those things. Like, people come into my store all the time and tell me stories about him. I have gotten so many stories about him since the book came out. He is such a bizarre individual. And to have, it's like it's out of a comic book. I mean, a children's psychiatric hospital is, first of all, the creepiest thing I can think of. Maybe if there's a clown training school next door, it could be a little creepier. Okay. And then he has a limp, and he is this weird guy. He's one of these wacky guys who likes to tell jokes and hear the sound of his own voice. And when the trial happened, I mean, I talked to one of the top reporters in the city at the time. He's now retired. He covered the trial. And what happened was at the end, when the judge gave his closing remarks, because of course, in this trial, Glenn chose to have a trial by judge, not by jury, because the jury would have convicted him. Hand over fist. I mean, Londoners were out for blood. Any doubt about it, they would have convicted him. So he chose just the judge. And the judge did not acquit him and did not convict him. He got the Scottish verdict of not proven, which I didn't even know you could give in Canada. I guess you could give it in 1970. And this reporter told me, he was in the room. He told me that the judge was verklempt, on the point of tears, and looked at Glenn and begged him, if you have committed these crimes, please get help. And then
Wow.
after the trial, Glenn walks out with this huge smile on his face, like he's been acquitted, like he's somehow been vindicated. I mean, no. The judge basically told everyone, I think you did it, but I can't send you to jail.
And you actually interviewed him. What was that experience like?
It's funny because when I first spoke to Glenn and when I first wrote to Glenn, I thought he was a very suspicious character, but I wasn't, I sort of was still thinking he might have been framed. I wasn't really sure if he was involved. I thought it might have been a situation where, the small town cops blamed the local weirdo, like Guy Palmeran. But it was when I was talking to him that I became convinced, really, he's manipulative. He is narcissistic. He loves to talk. He loves to be heard. He likes to put on a show for you. But he has this incredible smokescreen, and his smokescreen is his faith. It's his religion. So if you ask him a question and he doesn't want to answer it in a straight way, he'll just start reciting a hymn or something from the Book of Psalms. He uses God to disguise the evil inside of him.
After our break, more questions are answered by my guest, Vanessa Brown, including, is the London Police Department still actively investigating these murders? And we're back. Didn't Glenn Fryer go back and try to befriend the English family, specifically her younger brother?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm accused of murdering your kid, Eric, I'm not going to then, and I wasn't acquitted. I'm not going to then call you up and be like, hey, let's hang out. I want to be friends with your son.
Right.
It's totally weird. I asked him, why would you go back and be friends with them? And of course, his answer is something about showing God's love or whatever. But it's totally weird behavior. And to me, it just smacks of psychopathic thinking, going and wanting to control, wanting to have the inside scoop, wanting to watch and see what's happened, having his fingers in that pie so he can control what's going on afterwards. Allegedly. I'm not supposed to go out there and actually say I think Glenn Fryer did it, but I can say allegedly, can't I?
You can, yes. It's a little odd, though, isn't it, that Jackie's mother would have allowed him into their lives?
Yeah, I mean, she had her own mental health problems to begin with, but at the same time, she did confide in her daughter, Anne, that she had snooped through Fryer's mail. I wonder if she suspected him and wanted to keep him close so she could keep an eye on him or get some information about him. I don't know. It does feel like there's a missing piece, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. And just to tie up the Harrison story, you had earlier mentioned that they had died in a mysterious fire only about 2 years after all this happened.
Yeah, so in 1973, there was a fire at the Harrison home, and they all died. It was a very suspicious fire, and there was an inquiry afterwards, and no cause was determined. I did speak with an officer. He had been a beat cop at the time. He was a pretty new cop, and he got assigned to watch the scene overnight. And the word on the scene with the cops was that someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through the window.
Yeah.
Now, it is interesting that you mentioned the Harrisons, and we were just talking about my interview with Glenn. Glenn made a point, and it frankly made my blood run cold, of mentioning to me about how the Harrisons died, that they died in a fire. And I have heard a conversation with him with another person where he basically describes this fire as the wrath of God punishing those who had come against him. I find that fire very suspicious. The family had a dog. Now, the dog in the initial attack that had been with Betty when she was attacked in 1969, that dog had been poisoned, which is also incredibly suspicious.
Wow.
And so they'd gotten a new dog, a big German Shepherd named Chumo. And Chumo drove the neighbors crazy with his barking. I mean, this dog barked at everything. The mailman, people walking by, cars coming down the street. It was an annoying dog. And on the night of the fire, the dog didn't make a peep. In fact, the next door neighbor didn't even know there was a fire there until the fire trucks came. She was sleeping right through it. So that's very suspicious to me. And also the fact that it was a tiny 2-bedroom cottage, and these bodies were found right by the front door. I don't understand how in this inferno didn't get out of the house. It wasn't a multi-story house. They didn't get trapped upstairs or something, you know?
Wow.
So it's a very suspicious fire. And there are a series of fires in the book. There's also a fire that I did not include in the book that's also very suspicious. And I guess if there's ever a follow-up, I'll have to include that one too. But because, of course, the house Jackie English had lived in, that old crappy tenement building where she and her brother met the 2 men, that building burned down as well, actually just a month previous to the Harrison fire. So about 6 weeks earlier. So these 2 fires happened quite close together. The first at the old tenement building, and then the Harrisons, these suspicious arsons.
Fryer may very well have answers that he takes to his grave. But another figure in these events who likely knows more than they are admitting was someone who considered herself Jackie English's best friend, a young lady named Marilyn Hurd. And that's another strange story, how she inserted herself into all of this and some of the weird things that kind of happened to her.
Yeah. About a month after Jackie's disappearance and murder, this girl she worked with at the same restaurant where she was taken from tried to commit suicide. And her body was found downtown behind a department store, and they saved her. They took her to the hospital. And when they did, they found a picture of Jackie English in her pocket. And on the back was written, "Let the name of her killer go to the grave with me." So, of course, the police immediately thought this teenage girl who's attempted suicide knows who killed Jackie English. But Marilyn would never say. Marilyn has never said.
Yeah.
She called herself Jackie's best friend, and yet, according to the diary and any records we have, she'd only known Jackie for about a month before she died. So, saying she was her best friend was a bit of a stretch, unless they met sooner. If they did, Jackie never mentioned it in her diary. I don't know where they would have met. But, Marilyn, came from a difficult family that had an alcoholic father, a lot of mental health problems in the family, a lot of abuse, a lot of trauma. And, she's had a very difficult life. So, I actually opted not to interview her because I felt like when she's been living as an inpatient in psychiatric hospitals or in assisted living facilities for the last 25 years. So, I didn't want to exploit her. And, nothing she says is at this point going to have any evidentiary value. Her testimony can't be used in court. And half of what she says is delusional. She thinks that she had a child with Harrison Ford from Star Wars, and she thinks the Star Wars movies contain secret messages for her, But the lead detective on the case continued to question her for years. He even took her for hypnosis in the 1980s. So, Marilyn is a figure that we can't really, and when it comes to my greater theory of the case, Marilyn is an important figure. She actually knew Glenn Fryer. So that's an interesting connection there.
So is this case currently being investigated?
There is no cold case squad in Ontario. So when it comes to the larger policing body that should be working on the case, I'm not someone who's going to go and say, oh, the police aren't doing their job. That's not a productive conversation to have. The fact of the matter is that 99% of people who go into policing do it for the right reasons. And if you have worked your way up the ladder to become a homicide detective, you probably have some sort of skill set. We all hear stories about horrible detectives doing a crappy job, and I'm sure that there are many out there, but I'm not interested in pointing fingers that way. What I will say is that Ontario does need a cold case squad. It needs the system set up for that. It needs the money for that. And, there should be officers working on these cases full time. I know that there are officers who have worked on this case. I've spoken with those officers. I know that the OPP has evidence. I know they have a very challenging DNA sample that could be potentially useful if technology can get to the point where they can use it. Anne English, Jackie's sister, she always says it's an open case, but it's not an active one. She knows that they're not doing a lot, and whether that's for lack of resources or lack of interest, or, some people have said, they might not want to admit to mistakes they made in the past. Whatever the reason is, I think without public pressure, without public interest, that law enforcement doesn't have a lot of motivation, or at least the people who are motivated to solve the crime, they need us to speak up and say that we want this crime solved, so that the higher ups will give them the time and the money to do it.
Right. And I mean, it's old, but it's not that old. A lot of peripheral figures are still alive who might easily know something.
Absolutely.
It's still solvable.
Completely solvable. I 100% believe it. But you'd be amazed how many people say, oh, it was 50 years ago. It was so long ago. Why are you bringing that up?
Yeah.
It's very strange to me how there's any logic there that the amount of time that has passed somehow makes the crime less important. That doesn't make any sense to me. These are still violent crimes. We still have the unsolved deaths of young women and children in our city's history. And you're right, 50 years is not a long time. If you're 25, you might think it is. But the older you get, the more you realize 50 years is nothing. It really doesn't make any sense to me that they haven't solved it. I think it's very solvable. You don't want to have tunnel vision, right? I am completely open to new theories and new information. Bring it. I want to look at it. But the evidence has sort of created my working theory. And I would love for new evidence to come forward that would say I was wrong, or to rule it out and say, no, I must be wrong, because these two things can't coexist together. But every time I do a new interview, every time a member of the public comes to me with new information, it only solidifies my theory. There are two main suspects in my book. They're in there for a reason. And I hope that when people read it, they can see all the things that I can't say out loud and put those pieces together, because it's a really fascinating puzzle, and it actually is quite simple.
So you did have access to police files?
Just the ones from Detective Alsop.
But besides those, you weren't allowed access to the files in the police department?
No, definitely not. Which is another frustration. I mean, we know that the law is slow on purpose. It's conservative on purpose. But law enforcement tends to be the last arena where they adopt new technologies, new psychological theories. Sociology and psychology had definitely covered everything that the FBI brought into the behavioral science unit long before the creation of the behavioral science unit. So the law is slow for a reason. But I would like to see, if they don't have the time or resources, the use of civilian manpower. Nothing an NDA can't solve. There are academics and scientists and all sorts of criminologists and profilers and people who could help on these cases who'd be willing to do so, frankly, for no money at all. There's a huge community of sleuths who, would love to work on these cases. And yes, there's always going to be a hanger-on, an amateur who doesn't really know what they're talking about, doesn't have their facts straight, and maybe just clutters things up with noise. But you can weed them out, and you can find people who actually do know what they're talking about and have something really vital to offer. I have information that the police don't have. I've offered it. They haven't taken it. I don't know why. So there's a frustration there. All I can say is that the book came out October 4th, 2019, the 50th anniversary of Jackie's murder. And I'm still researching a book I already wrote. The investigation hasn't ended for me, and I don't think it will until the case is solved.
Right. And the killer could still be alive. And there should be someone in the London Police Department who takes the lead on this with the DNA sample. It might even prevent another death.
Oh, and these aren't just murders in London. Okay, so I've got a murder in 66 and then a blank spot and a spate of murders from 68 to 70. And then I have more blank spots. That's not because he wasn't killing. He wasn't killing in London. I chose when I was working on the book not to expand it geographically to include other murders, but I have a whole series of 1967 murders I think he committed. Same MO, same guy. Transportation, strangulation, blunt force trauma, typo. It's all the same guy. I mean, you're talking about someone who has been a prolific child murderer for over 50 years. It's not just about the London, Ontario cases. This is a much larger, it's a much wider scope to look through and see. You're talking about probably one of the most prolific serial killers in Canadian history. And he's just sitting there, I don't know, watching Wheel of Fortune or something. I don't know. What do old guys do? Watching reruns of Tom Cruise movies from the 90s and
right. So the DNA sample, from what victim did it come from, and what is it exactly?
Yeah, there are DNA samples from a few of the crime scenes, but the Jackie English crime scene is the one that has the most viable DNA sample that has never, as far as I know, been tested because it is a mixed sample. Now, I've been told it's a mixed sample. What does that mean? Well, it could mean a variety of things. My guess is that it's her entire internal genitalia from the autopsy, so probably mixed with degraded human tissue. So there'd be like semen mixed in with her uterus or her vaginal canal. That's my guess. It could also be mixed in with her DNA just from the way it was retrieved, because the way samples were taken in the 1960s is completely different from how they were taken now. It was typed. We know it's type O. Jackie's boyfriend at the time was type O. He said he had had sex with her. But in 1978, he was arrested on an assault charge, and he told the arresting officers that he never had sex with Jackie English. I'm inclined to believe him. So, if we have the same type O semen that was also found at the other crime scenes, Georgia Jackson, Jackie Dunleavy, we probably have a consistent perp.
Promise me if you solve this, you will come back on the show.
Absolutely, Eric. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course.
And I hope your listeners will, find out about the Jackie English case, whether or not it's from my book, whatever. Just spread the story that there are these unsolved murders in Ontario, in southwestern Ontario, and they need to be solved before the criminal dies. Frankly, let's get justice before he's underground.
Oh, exactly. So you own a bookstore. Can people just buy the book directly from you?
Yeah, if you go to brownanddixon.com, that's DICKSON. You can order it there. I'm happy to sign a copy and send it your way. You can also buy it through all your major chain bookstores.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Again, I have been speaking to Vanessa Brown. She is the author of The Forest City Killer, a serial murderer, a cold case sleuth, and a search for justice. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.